Ladies and gentlemen, could I have your attention, please? Ladies and gentlemen, could I have your attention, please? A very warm welcome to everyone to this year's Housman Lecture, organized by the UCL Department of Greek and Latin. My name is Gesine Manowald, and I'm the head of this department, and in that capacity it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this evening's events. It's marvelous to see so many people interested in the work of Greek and Latin and related disciplines. I'll just be the warm-up and introduce you to this evening's proceedings. Obviously, the main event will be Judith Butler's lecture, and afterwards, my colleague Firoz Bazunia, Chair of Greek here at UCL, will conclude this part of the evening with a vote of thanks. Afterwards, we will proceed to a drinks reception in the foyer, to which all of you are warmly invited. Before we welcome tonight's speaker, just a few brief housekeeping items. We obviously do not expect a fire drill or an actual fire to happen in the next hour, but just in case, make a note of the fire exits, which you see marked on both sides of the room. Some of my colleagues will act as stewards in the event of an evacuation and help you to get to a safe place. But as I said, we don't expect that this will be needed. As I already mentioned, there will be a reception after the lecture just outside the lecture theatre. Just follow the crowds and do stay for the reception and join us in raising a glass to Greek drama and gender studies. I also want to tell you that we will offer wine, so you can enjoy a drink without being affected by what Housman is said to have voiced, namely that ale, man, ale is the stuff to drink for fellows whom it hurts to think. I also want to advise you that the lecture will be filmed and live streamed, but don't worry, that only affects the speakers and not the audience, but it also means that afterwards you can watch it again on YouTube if you want to see it again. So, if we have counted correctly, this is the 9th UCL Housman Lecture, named, of course, after the person I've already mentioned, A.E. Housman. As you probably know, A.E. Housman was among our illustrious predecessors in the Department of Greek and Latin. He was not only a well-known poet, now best remembered for his collection of poems in the Shropshire Laird, but also Professor of Latin at UCL from 1892 to 1911 when he moved to Cambridge. What is most remarkable from our point of view, perhaps, is that Housman never received a degree, but his independent studies had created such a reputation that UCL offered him a job. Although Housman was appointed as a professor of Latin, he worked on both Greek and Latin topics. So it is appropriate that the UCL Housman Lectures form a series of lectures that were inaugurated by the Department of Greek and Latin about 12 years ago and cover both Greek and Latin topics. They're intended to bring well-known scholars from outside London to UCL and to have them present their research to colleagues, students, alumni, and the general public. They're also published as pamphlets and, as I mentioned, sometimes filmed. Lectures on Latin topics are supported by the Department of Greek and Latin and the Greek and Latin alumni. Lectures on Greek topics, as today's lecture, are generously funded by the A.G. Leventis Foundation, which has awarded a major grant to the Department of Greek and Latin to support activities promoting Greek culture. These various sources of support enable us to have distinguished speakers every year, for which we are immensely grateful. This year, this has allowed us to invite Professor Judith Butler, and it's a great pleasure to welcome her here to UCL. Judith Butler is Maxine Elliot Professor of Comparative Literature at the University of California at Berkeley. She has published widely on critical theory, gender and sexuality studies, 19th and 20th century continental philosophy, as well as social and political thought. She has received the Adorno Prize from the city of Frankfurt in 2012 in honor of her contributions to feminist and moral philosophy, the Brudner Prize from Yale University for Lifetime Achievement in Gay and Lesbian Studies, and the Research Lecturer Honor at UC Berkeley in 2005. Her work has always had a link with classical antiquity, as becomes apparent by book titles such as Antigone's Claim, Kinship Between Life and Death, published in 2000. Today's topic, Kinship Trouble in the Bacchae, is connected with Professor Butler's interest in queer theory and gender studies in relation to Greek drama. Housman himself published on old Greek tragedians, producing translations, commenting on issues of textual criticism, and reviewing the work of others. He might not have known what gender studies is, and might not have been particularly interested in this area, but since he believed that there was always something to learn, I'm sure he would have had an open mind for it. For he said in his own inaugural lecture, given at UCL on the 3rd of October 1892, "The sum of things to be known is inexhaustible, and however long we read, we shall never come to the end of our storybook." Certainly, though, by listening to this evening's talk, we will gather new insight and come a bit closer to this end. Please join me in welcoming Professor Judith Butler, and I'll now hand over to her. We are very much looking forward to your talk on the Bacchae.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Let's make sure that's working. Good? All right. First of all, thank you. I'm enormously honored to be here and grateful to the Department of Greek and Latin Studies here at UCL for this invitation. Of course, it's a daunting invitation since I'm not a classicist and I roam about at will. So you'll see something of what a non-specialist does with an important specialization. I also just wanted to note that, as some of you know, the change of venue that took place in order to accommodate more people meant that we're in a space that is not equipped for people with disabilities, and that means that this event is not in compliance with the Equality Act of 2010, which I spent part of the afternoon reading this act, which is in fact a very interesting act. But we have arranged for a live feed for those who are not able to enter this hall, and I'm going to make some time to meet with them separately on another occasion in the next couple of days. So here this evening, I am interested in kinship, but not so much in its subversive forms. Rather, I want to query whether kinship works, and if so, how kinship works, how it sometimes fails to work. One of my interests along the way is to begin to reconsider how tragedy allows us to think about the laws of kinship or the norms that govern its practice. When I say that kinship works, I mean that a set of relations proves to be binding and recognizable, organizing fundamental relations of dependency pertaining to life and death in time and space. That definition is, of course, too broad, but it establishes a framework that can be qualified in what follows. What draws me to this question is an extraordinary and very ordinary fact, namely that people are periodically confused about kinship, even those kin relations who are expected to be closest. And so, though we may want to define from the start kin relations as recognizable, it turns out that they are sometimes nearly or fully unrecognizable. Children do ask, "Are you my mother?" And a fair amount of children's fiction is oriented around the question of whether or not a given animal, for instance, is or is not a child's mother. Baby llamas wander about the streets asking all kinds of animals, "Are you my mama?" Have you read that one? Suggesting that visual perception does not furnish a sturdy enough criterion for that determination. Later in life, or even the other day on the subway, one hears remarks such as, "What kind of mother are you?" spoken by a daughter, or even, "What, I have a brother?" like that, meaning no, spoken with disdain, or, what sometimes happens to me and my partner, "Which one is the real mother?" At such moments, a certain incredulity or doubt is introduced into the practice of kin designation. The person referred to or addressed is oddly not commensurate with the kinship category that person is supposed to inhabit. The question separates the person from the category, raising the more general question of how kinship categories do and do not quite attach to the persons they are supposed to name, as well as the relationships they are supposed to designate and secure. We can ask questions such as, "Will you be my father?" Or in exasperation, "Am I really your son?" And in such instances, the questions are serious inasmuch as they elaborate a wish or express confusion or alienation, and they tell us that something is not settled in the house of kinship. There are times when one cannot believe that someone is one's family member or one's president. Okay. And there are other times when one is plainly enraged that they are. Yet other times we cannot quite recognize them as kin, even though they have been in that position for some time. Recognition falters in the midst of kinship. That may well be one of its defining moments. So let's ask first a prior question. Why care about kinship? Well, one clear reason is that rights of parenting are highly disputed, and in some countries and regions, sexual orientation and marital status are preconditions for adoption or even access to reproductive technology. And sometimes, as we know, people lose their children when their gender status changes or when their sexual orientation becomes known. Indeed, I could spend the rest of the evening enumerating enraging examples of this kind, but it's not quite my purpose this evening. When struggling for the legitimacy of certain forms of kinship, we tend not to focus on what forms of kinship might be subversive or even what kinds of disruptions we might find at the heart of kinship categories. And yet, it seems important that we do so, especially if we want to know what we are getting into. So if we wanted to be able to name and pursue disruptive forms of kinship, and even if we wanted to break with kinship altogether as a model for intimate, generational, or interdependent associations, we would probably need first to know what kinship is or whether it can be stably defined. If kinship is itself a way of ordering relationships, and we are looking to find something disruptive about them, could it be that this particular ordering of relations disrupts another order of relations? That seems to be the case when, for instance, Antigone, defying Creon and defending the honor and memory of at least one of her brothers, invokes the household gods to justify her act of loyalty to her brother by giving him a public burial in defiance of the edict of Creon the sovereign not to do so. But even then, matters are somewhat confused, since Creon is, after all, her uncle, and she is therefore defying both filial and state duties when, in refusing to honor his decree that her brother Polynices not be buried, she goes ahead and buries him anyway. In that moment, it seems that Antigone is defying her uncle, and so causing quite a problem within that household that is also a kingdom. And that is made all the more clear when she rather rudely dismisses her living sister Ismene, insisting that she undertake her defiant act alone. She honors her brother by rejecting her sister and attacking her uncle. No great guardian representative of the household gods is she. Kinship in this instance is already implicated in politics, if not its own site of war. Belligerent politics is implicated in kinship. After all, Creon is mad because his nephew has defied him, a nephew citizen, as it were, who thus redoubles his act of disloyalty by waging war against his sovereign uncle. Although we might say that in Antigone's case, the household, the oikos, is identified with the militarized state, we have yet to see how war enters into kinship as one of its defining possibilities. Family conflict is, of course, one way to talk about this war within kinship, but I want to suggest that when we speak about kinship, we are always talking about the possibility of a certain rupture. Someone contests another's claim. Someone else refuses to honor a command. In short, someone breaks with someone else for some reason or refuses to speak to them anymore, or starts to hold back money, or gives the money inexplicably to another relative, or commits acts of unequal treatment and initiates temporary or permanent breaks. Sound familiar? Even in those extreme instances, when someone decides to disown another person, that form of disowning only makes sense in terms of what we call kinship. Indeed, it defines a possibility or limit that centrally defines the field of its operations. Not everyone can disown anyone else. If a stranger seeks to disown me legally, I would find that strange, if not intriguing. I would assume that the person suffered a category mistake or mistook me for one of his relatives, a kind of street transference that really does happen when straight people suddenly yell at you as if you are a relative. But for the most part, one has to be already related for that kind of break to happen. And when it does happen, it is a break in the relationship. Acts of extreme renunciation, even expulsion from the family, powerfully define those kinship relations that remain avowed. Ghosts are always populating kin relations, and tragedy is one of the places where we see that most clearly. If we define kinship as a particular way of organizing people intergenerationally, whether or not we understand it as derived from reproductive relations or patrilineality or freely chosen intimate associations, legally or non-legally established, we still imagine kinship as an organization that works, that really does organize and bring people together and order relationships through time and space. But if we do define it that way, as an enduring or binding set of relations, clearly mappable, have we perhaps infused a certain idealization into the definition that is defied by the practice itself? The presumption of such a description is that kinship lasts and that it endures in a stable form. It is not a particularly contemporary or culturally restrictive claim to make if one acknowledges that the possibility of breakage, of disowning or being disowned, and even the periodic breakdown of perceptual structures of recognition may well inhere in the very practice of kinship. If that is true, the question is not so much which forms of kinship do we want and which are disruptive of the dominant norms, but rather whether kinship is not, by definition, dependent on the possibility of disruption, understood as relationships that are invariably marked or haunted by the possibility of failing or fading. Of course, we want to distinguish between more ordered and perhaps conservative forms of kinship and those that might be more innovative and disruptive. But can we imagine order on one side and disruption as its alternative? Matters become more complicated when we realize that kinship in English is not quite translatable into other languages. For instance, in French, one encounters a distinction between parenté and filiation. The first delineates the legal relation between child and parent, usually regarded as father or mother, as a result of lineage or legal ties that emerge from familial transmission, including the transmission of property. Filiation can include what are generally understood to be blood ties, and so intersects with parenté, but can also include familial relations that are not based on conjugality or directly situated within a trackable lineage. Filiation can and does exceed parenté. And yet, do both not constitute domains of kinship in English? Indeed, depending on which aspect of kinship one wants to identify or support, one chooses to translate kinship with one word or another. Lévi-Strauss preferred to talk about parenté, but he also underscored and elaborated the anthropological distinction between relations based on descent and those based on status. For Lévi-Strauss, the family was but one form of organizing kinship, but the two terms were certainly not equivalent. Lévi-Strauss did not quite explain, however, how kinship comes into being outside the framework of conjugality or lineage, although contemporary scholars have been left to reflect on how that status can be achieved through practices, and whether kinship, as Elizabeth Freeman has suggested, can be a kind of doing. Oddly enough, the term kinship became quite important within feminist anthropology in the US and the UK in the 1970s, precisely because it facilitated a set of questions about forms of relationship that were binding, even constitutive, but could not be reduced to particular forms of the family. At that time, it was important to know that neither the nuclear heterosexual family nor male domination were natural forms or historical necessities. The term kinship, very important to ethnographic study in anthropology, was larger than the term family, since the sphere of relations that regulated dependency, matters of birth and death, or inheritance and obligation could not always be adequately described by the contemporary norms of the family. If kinship relations exceed family relations, then the family is but one historical instance of kinship, which means that with the assistance of the term kinship, we can start to ask through what kinds of relationships are the most basic of human bonds forged and formed, what are their variabilities and possibilities, their temporal and spatial organization. How do we think about queer kinship or modes of intimate alliance that take neither conjugality nor reproduction as their defining moments or organizing principles, and where dependency is not figured primarily by the child? Of course, this leads to an even more complicated terrain, since not all human bonds can be kin relations, and not all kin relations are human. So how do we distinguish, if we do, between, or among rather, family, kin, friendship, cross-species cohabitation and community, and even broader modes of belonging that provide some kind of provisional and iterable structure to intimate and social relations? Note how quickly we seem to arrive at disorientation by virtue of the instability of the categories themselves. If kinship is exclusively defined neither by reproductive nor by marital relations, how do we then delimit the field of kin? Or are we of necessity launched into a domain that cannot be delimited? We have, it seems, two different kinds of questions at issue. The first is what kinds of relations we call kinship rather than, say, friendship or community. The second is whether those we call kin are stably and enduringly marked in that way. In other words, can the field of kinship be delimited and stabilized, and are our kinship categories subjected to a disruption, meaning that the possibility of their coming to an end, or even suddenly starting, constitutes them from the outset? I am aware that for some time anthropologists no longer engage in the study of kinship as if it could be comprehensively charted and mapped. Over and against those who might claim that there are real kin relations and then there are fictive ones, a strong argument has been made that the delineation of kin relations involves us in the making of fictions, the elaboration of imaginary scenarios in which the fixed and unequivocal character of kin relations is presumed, usually with marriage and reproduction at its center. The very stipulation of what kinship is thus carries a certain commitment to what it should be, which means that it is less the starting point for a set of descriptions than the articulation of a set of idealizations or even fantasies. My wager is that we cannot really begin with stipulative definitions of kin relations, not only because what counts as kin is subject to historical change, but because we may only know kinship relations through the breach. Or so that would be one lesson we might take from the nexus of Greek tragedy and an analysis of contemporary cultural forms that draw upon psychoanalysis. From that perspective, it might prove more useful to ask, at what particular moments does someone become kin? Or is someone recognized to be kin? And at what point, and for what reason, do they become unknown or unknowable as kin? Why is it that kin relations make themselves known precisely when they are less easily recognized or in the aftermath of not having been recognized at all? Kinship might arise at a moment in which one feels acute forms of ambivalence, such as, I cannot live without this person, and I must absolutely live with this person, or I must absolutely live without this person. And all of those being true at the same time. There's a good chance that person is your kin. Or this person loves me madly, and so I will surely be killed by this person if I am killed by anyone at all. At such a moment, we might not explicitly say to ourselves, oh, I am in the throes of kinship. Or ask, is this kinship that has me in its grip? But one does usually understand that if, for instance, echoing throughout one's daily life is the sense that one's father said you are perfect and one's mother wanted you dead, or the same parent who said one was perfect also wanted one dead, these are active traces of kinship that have become part of psychic life. The point is not just that primary others once said or did such things, but that the saying and the doing can continue without them, even when, especially when they are gone. Such utterances or propositional forms give shape to perception and operate in spectral and audible ways, even when the speaker no longer exists and the utterance can no longer be heard. Surely we can think about the intergenerational transmission of trauma along these lines. Or again, if one's grandmother said, and in some ways still says, why don't you eat my food? You don't like it? And then right when you start eating says, you know, you don't have to eat so much. Why do you feel like you have to finish the plate? Oh, all right, I'm just saying. Kinship might then reside in those sudden swings that belong to the idiosyncratic absolutes of affective life. Desiring intense adulation and fearing death, for instance, but also never quite being sure whether one is eating because one is simply hungry or not hungry and so not eating, or eating without hunger or not eating even though one is hungry. Similar echoes tend to reverberate through ordinary modes of living together with other people. I belong here in this house with these others. I will die if I stay here in this house with these others. This is one form the knot of kinship takes, one echo by which it makes its enduring if fugitive presence known. In this sense, kinship is not precisely an order that quells a disturbance or a disruption, but rather a disruption that takes place, a breach that is prior to any question of rule or law. Indeed, order, rule, and law always arrive belatedly to make sense of the breach, but as we know, they rarely stop the breach from happening again. Indeed, the rules and laws of kinship, including the incest taboo, seem to presume the potential breach, which means perhaps that the breach precedes the rule and even proves essential to its establishment. Indeed, the repetition of the breach is precisely the sign and substance of kinship itself. So I am saying neither that all kinship relations endure, nor that they all come to an end, only that when and where they do exist, they seem to be partially defined by those constitutive possibilities of temporal duration and rupture. My stronger suggestion is that kinship charts and genealogical studies and any of the formal analyses of kinship that we find in classical modes of anthropology or archival history all seek to codify a set of relations that are from the start subject to misrecognition and even murderous confusion. So if we think about Oedipus, the truth of the matter is that he could not properly recognize his mother or his father, or at least he could not recognize them consciously, which opens up the question of how unconscious forms of intimating kinship can take place. He murders that guy coming toward him on the road, but that guy only becomes for him his father once he's told by someone reliable that Polybus, the man who raised him, is not his father. Of course, his circumstances are not so usual, since his parents sent him off with a shepherd to be abandoned on a hillside, exposed to the elements and left to die. Odd that Freud does not identify infanticide rather than incest as the primary wish conveyed by Sophocles' play. Okay, sorry. Whatever desires such a child might form under those initiating conditions are probably marked both by the fact that his parents wanted him dead and others decided to cover up that hideous truth. Oedipus journeys a long way, journeys a long away from Polybus and Merope, depending on a story, relying on a story he's been told by a drunken stranger that he was born with a curse upon him and that he was fated to destroy both of his parents in different ways, of course. He thinks he's traveling away from those parents and that fate. He situates his kinship relations in the terms given to him by that narrative, so he relies on an initial set of stories about who his parents are and then another report about a curse which prompts him to take action. I don't know why he was in a foul mood as he walked down that road and the huge caravan came toward him, but maybe he was out of sorts that he had to leave his home because of a curse. I mean, it's an odd story, no, because, I mean, the truth of the matter is this guy comes towards him and he has to get out of the way. I understand that's, you know, that's a problem, getting out of the way for a big caravan. But there's a fight that ensues, and Oedipus, you would think, would have hesitated right before committing murder to say, oh, there's a curse upon me. Like, maybe this guy's my father. Could this guy be my father? No hesitation, no hesitation. Okay. Kinship first gets established by someone else giving an authoritative narrative of the relationship, one that involves a form of instruction, say mama or papa, and the child starts sounding out what he or she has heard, and then some preliminary form of recognition takes place that starts to install kin relations in linguistic ones. Getting the sound right, directing it to the appropriate object, is among the first forms that kinship recognition takes. Of course, this is in a situation where there is someone there who is being designated as kin. There is no way for an infant in the midst of learning how to enunciate to evaluate the claim that this is your mother or your father. That emergent being finds its way into the incipient moments of speech relying on mimetic directives, which are composed of sounding out forms of address and naming stray objects, usually cat and ball. Okay, but I go astray since, as we know, Oedipus does not know his kin precisely because he would then know that he was supposed to commit parricide and incest. They thought to have him die first, to let someone else take him away and prepare his death out of sight. If he knew his parents, he would know about murder, the murder that was feared and the murder that was nearly committed. He would know about the curse on him. In other words, if he were to know kinship relations, he would have to understand them as potentially murderous. Although usual readings of Oedipus Rex assume that there's a difference between his real parents and those who simply acted the part, it would seem that the couple that gave birth to him and the couple who raised him were really both part of what we might call parenting. I know that ruins the plot. It is not untrue to claim that Oedipus had two fathers and two mothers, though much of the tragic drama of the play depends on our accepting the ontological difference between those who reproduce the child and those who rear the child. Why do we do that? In practice, both activities can be part of parenting, but not necessarily. If he had slain Polybus, it would have been a different play. We might have thought at first that it was parricide, only to learn later that it was simple murder. And if he had slept with Merope, we would have thought that was incest, only later to conclude that even if it wasn't, it was just plain disturbing. But like Oedipus, we depend on how the story is told in order to gain our coordinates within the web of kinship. And though in Freud's early readings of Oedipus Rex, he identifies incest as the early wish of the male child, it seems that prior to any possibility of incest is an infanticidal wish on the part of the parents. Oedipus is presumed to want to sleep with his mother, but his mother has allied with his father to let him die on a hillside. The incestuous desire of the child is preempted by the murderous desire of the parents. Now, if Oedipus had hesitated on the road before he slayed Laius, if he had stopped to wonder whether the man with the caravan coming toward him, taking up all that space, pushing him aside, already a kind of murderous force coming in his direction, an ancient form of road rage, I presume. If he had stopped to wonder if this could be his father, he would have had to started to doubt the story he'd been told and conceive the father as one who is willing to run him down. Indeed, that murderous underpinning of the story of kinship was essential to the story. But given that Oedipus left Corinth precisely because he did not want to do harm to those he considered to be his parents, he might still worry about doing harm to anyone, since it would seem that the one to whom he wants to do the most harm would presumably be the father. In other words, given the curse, if Oedipus wants to kill someone, he might wonder whether, on the basis of that fact alone, that person could be his father. If the curse defines kinship in such a way that the father is the one he wants to murder and the mother is the one with whom he wishes to have sexual relations, it would seem to follow that those kin relations are established through those desires. So, in a way, Oedipus produces his father by killing him and establishes mother by sleeping with her. They are apparently the singular object of those particular desires. The recognition comes later, of course. In the moment of passion, those kin relations cannot be seen, and this constitutes the frailty of the incest taboo, as well as the taboo against parricide. Simply put, one cannot see what one is doing in the heat of those passions. The incest taboo only works if we can recognize kinship, but kinship, it seems, are precisely those relations that are most difficult to recognize. So if we ask, at least for Oedipus, whether the father becomes the father at the moment of the murder, and if the mother in some sense ascends to her maternal place at the moment in which a belated recognition is made, is that she is the one with whom he had sexual relations. If we ask that, or if kinship really gets conferred later and from some elsewhere, then a stray story that someone tells us about a time when one did not exist, the retrospective acknowledgement comes with infinite guilt and self-punishment. These are two acts he performs, and they turn out to be breaches of the relationship. and it is only as a consequence of the breach that he belatedly recognizes that that man and that woman, his wife and his father, that woman, his wife, are his father and his mother. Kinship arrives through a startled question. What? Was that my father I slew? What? That was my mother with whom I slept? Many characters in Greek tragedy have to be persuaded that someone was their kin only after a certain set of actions have taken place. And that persuasion usually happens through authoritative narratives that someone, usually blind, like Tiresias, feels compelled to offer. Still, in both Oedipus Rex and Euripides The Bacchae, characters suffer from protracted incredulity about who those people or animals may be to whom they are said to be related. The divine enters the picture as well. Has the divine become human or animal? Is it the spirit of metamorphosis itself? In Euripides' play, The Bacchae, the frenzied hunt and dismemberment of Pentheus is accomplished most dramatically by his mother, Agae, in a kind of blind frenzy. At the same time, that destructive spree is pursued collectively by the Bacchic women in response to Dionysus' command to hunt and kill Pentheus. As in Antigone, a war is conducted within the play to see whose command will finally hold sway. Pentheus, the ruler, cannot rule the women who, under the influence of Dionysus, particularly his song and his command, have suddenly left their habitual weaving, gone off into the woods, and given their bodies over, presumably to men who are described by one British translator as lecherous. In fact, if you check the various translations, there's lots of fantasy about what actually did happen in those woods. Pentheus looks upon the scene and decides that this unbridled sexual lust is a threat to his own sovereignty. In rage, he asks, "Must I be slave to my own slave women?" Pentheus has lost control of the women, or rather, in losing control of his women, he loses sovereign authority. And the women have entered into libidinal frenzy, occupying themselves first with wine, song, dance, and presumably unrestrained sexual relations, but we don't really get any descriptions. When Dionysus arrives in those woods, androgynous and charismatic, commanding them to hunt and destroy Pentheus, they follow, a little bit like followers of Charles Manson. His song seduces and excites them, but his command controls them. And it is at this point that their desire is redirected to satisfy his command. So though there are readings of this play that tend to celebrate the sexual liberation of women from domesticity, let us note that the women are not precisely liberated, but rather submit deliriously to another man's command. Just for the record, Cadmus is the father of Agae and Semele. Semele gives birth to Dionysus, or so it seems, and dies after releasing Dionysus to Zeus in the midst of her pregnancy. Agae gives birth to Pentheus, so the agon of the play is between two cousins, Pentheus and Dionysus, both of whom are vying for control over the women. Throughout the play, kinship takes form as an accusation, a fantasy, or a guilt-ridden recognition. The play opens with Dionysus, who has assumed the form of a man, who explains why he has chosen Thebes as the place to raise his Bacchic shout and start recruiting women to leave their homes for the woods. Semele, his mother, after being urged to lie by her father, Cadmus, claims in public that Zeus was, in fact, the father of her child. That is an odd thing for a father to do, but perhaps the position of the father within the play is to compel his daughter to lie precisely about who is the father of the child. The sisters of Semele had previously claimed that she bore the child by some mortal, and when she then died, this same group of truth-driven sisters claimed that Zeus took Semele's life because of the false accusation made against him. So the sisters are those who defend each other against false accusations, but they themselves have the hubris falsely to accuse the gods. Dionysus, clearly acting as Zeus's emissary, punishes them all with a form of delirium that drives them from their homes, a form of radical and sudden de-domestication. To be driven from the home is to find oneself outside the contained spatial organization of kinship itself. What interests me most is the very next moment. Dionysus boasts about intoxicating the women as punishment for their offense. I quote one translation, "Therefore I have driven those same sisters mad, turned them all frantic out of doors. Their home now is the mountain, their wits are gone. I have made them bear the emblem of my mysteries, the whole female population of Thebes, to the last woman I sent raving from their homes." In what sense, if any, has Dionysus offered us a justification for his action? Why precisely were the sisters driven mad, and why is it from the home that they are driven? Well, Dionysus understands himself as having induced them to such action, exercising a fully maddening effect on all the women, and so in this sense, he advertises his power and aggrandizes himself. How cool to drive each and every woman so utterly mad. At the same time, he is himself the effect of a set of circumstances he never chose, and in relation to which he remains powerless. He was not the one who boasted about Zeus as the father, and yet his mother is struck down for doing so, and he now explains his choice as a consequence of that unwilled sequence of deeds that preceded his life. Therefore, I have driven those sisters mad. What conjunction of forces do we find in that therefore? On the one hand, the sisters of Semele, who exposed the story about Zeus as a lie, are the ones who publicize the crime, and so in some sense, their public declaration of the crime solicits Zeus to level a punishment against the liar. On the other hand, they do regard Dionysus as a god, so saying Zeus is his father is really out of the question. Is it possible that Dionysus is the son of Zeus without Zeus being the father? Indeed, it is. When the chorus starts their delirious narration, they tell us that Zeus, enraged by the false accusation against him, throws a firebolt or a lightning flash that somehow extracts the child from the mother it kills. So Semele dies in the same flash that ejects the child into Zeus's hands. Eager to hide what is actually a gestating fetus, I presume, from Hera, who you will remember is always jealous, he sews that pre-infant creature into his own thigh with golden pins, where gestation presumably continues until Zeus himself gives birth in his own way via the thigh to baby Dionysus. It would seem that Dionysus assumes divine qualities when he's separated from his human mother, beamed up to Zeus, and certainly when he's sprung into the world by the unpinning of the thigh. So Zeus is not the father, unless, of course, we want to make a provision for pregnant fathers, a contemporary possibility for trans men, to be sure. But even then, Zeus is not exactly the biological father. Paradoxically, enraged by the false accusation, he takes over the gestational process, usurping the maternal place and killing her off. Why does the man, here a man god, become a mother when he is falsely accused of being the father? Since the gestational process is, as it were, sequentially divided between Semele and then Zeus, it would seem that Dionysus has two mothers. Confusing, perhaps, but hardly out of the question. These two mothers don't live together, they don't raise a son in common. The one lies about the other kills the first. Extracting Dionysus from the womb, Zeus establishes his thigh as a proper substitute location. The story seems to resolve into the following proposition. I, Zeus, was never the father, you all lied, but I am now the mother. I gave birth to my son Dionysus, himself a feminine form, a boy, girl, who will continue to punish those who accuse me of fathering him. A bit of gender trouble in the midst of kinship trouble, to be sure. This is one of the many interesting transformations in the play, and in some ways the motif is repeated when Dionysus persuades Pentheus to dress up as a woman to hold the thyrsus and to move and dance with the Bacchic women as one of them. Having fallen prey to the charms of Dionysus, Pentheus happily dresses up as a woman and then, interestingly, starts to see double. which is the Thebes he knows. The chorus, on whom we depend for some narrative orientation, itself becomes delirious, claiming now to be in thrall to Dionysus as well. And when Agae then leads the pack to dismember her son Pentheus, she does not recognize him. Does she fail to recognize him because he is, for the moment, a girl, or because he has not only departed from his first gender, but has, in fact, become an animal? She, of course, is convinced that she has hunted down a young mountain lion, and in her frenzy, she is acting the part of a huntress. So let's hold this in mind. Pentheus assumes first the appearance of a man, and then a woman, and then a wild animal, at which point he is killed. So when she holds the head of her son, after being asked to look a bit more closely, please, she asks who has done this monstrous deed. She does not recognize that she is the one who did the deed until Cadmus, her father, tells her the story, which is authoritatively narrated to her ex post facto. In an effort to restore order, Cadmus reasserts paternal authority, insisting that she recognize that she has killed her own son. Her initial refusal is followed by reluctant and appalled acceptance, and with that recognition comes grief, another defining sign of kinship, to be sure. But so too surely is the blindness. Kin positions are susceptible to misrecognition. No, I am not his father, but his mother. That's what Zeus seems to be saying. That is not my son, it is a mountain lion. Agae seems to be saying that. That is not my son, it is a mountain lion. Yes, that cannot be my mother, Dionysus, looking at Zeus. How did he come to be my father, that stranger? Oedipus' question retrospectively. Zeus is a mother, his son is a lion. Dionysus is himself and not himself. Even Tiresias, who makes an appearance as a dancing old man, is not quite himself for a while, yet is himself. After Agae boasts that she has left the life of weaving for hunting and for greater things, Cadmus finally reasserts paternal authority, insisting that she recognize that she has killed not a mountain lion, but her son. What follows is an infinite sorrow and remorse, or at least what promises to be bad. The women return home to their former masters, abandoning their new ones. This is not a story about women's liberation. And sexual pleasure is now linked not only with murderous destruction, but with infinite shame and sorrow. This is not a story about sexual liberation. So let us return to that strange sequence in which Pentheus is induced to dress and dance as one of the Bacchic women, and is then perceived as an animal and killed by his mother, herself in Bacchic frenzy as well. We move from one gender to the other and then to animality. We are at the same time also following a sequence in which lustful dancing leads to murder. When both Pentheus and Dionysus assume feminine form, it starts a series of misrecognitions that culminate with the confusion between animal and human forms. And all this seems precipitated by a divine creature who, in becoming human, Dionysus, occupies an oscillating set of gender positions. Shall we conclude that the transposition of gender, one that already took place when Zeus violently usurped the gestational process, continues as Dionysus beguiles with his feminine form and Pentheus becomes a dancing woman? In the course of these transitions, Agae sees that young mountain lion and moves in for the kill. What makes those transitions possible? Is it that there are already affinities, if not forms of kinship, between the one gender and the other, and between human and animal, such that they can become confused, sometimes quite easily, with one another? It is not that Pentheus is really a man and not a woman, or really a woman at the moment his mother sees him, and not an animal, although that is one way to describe the sequence and even one way to try to make it right. The change from one gender to the other, and then the move into animality, articulate relations that work transversely across established kinship ties based on claims of paternity and maternity. Those ties represent forms of affinity that work through metonymy and concentricity, not following the rules of kinship based only on reproductive lines. In crossing both the gender divide and the divine human animal divides, Pentheus articulates modes of crossing over that challenge those divisions and pose the question of whether there might be more overlap than such binary distinctions usually allow. But this is also a threatening situation for how to orient oneself in a world in which such typologies no longer hold. That he represents that breakdown may well be one reason why Pentheus is killed. What gets laid out in a dramatic story in Greek tragedy, or at least perhaps this one, is a kind of confusion or double vision that seems to characterize psychic life more generally, so that one cannot always tell the difference between, hey, one's lover and one's mother, oh sorry, I made that confusion, or between one's father and a stranger, oh I didn't realize you were my father, what one loves and seeks to preserve, or what one desires to destroy, what came over me. And one vacillates there in confusions, trying to separate the one from the other, but not always very successfully. As you can see, it is as if the one term is nearly disowned by the other, or the one term is engulfed by the other, or the confusion stays precisely where it is, vacillating, and one waits or struggles for clarity. These are not exactly narrative structures, but constitutive binds. In fact, nowhere are the positions and rules taken for granted here. They neither effectively order passions, nor do their punishments always hold firm. In this way, kinship relations are articulated not only in the breach wrought by passion, but also in the guilt and sorrow that follows. They are sites of murderous pleasure and infinite remorse. So though we might say that none of these stories would have the force they have were it not that kinship relations are already in place, regardless of whether they are appropriately recognized, it seems equally true that something about kinship has to be enacted through dramatic or narrative means for kinship to expose its fault lines and its persistence. Perhaps kinship cannot really be mapped as a stable set of positions because some part of its temporal life is enacted through displacement, inversion, and modes of passionate unknowingness. In other words, kinship is at least in part a mode of living out a set of passions that constantly disrupt one another. I love you, I murder you, I cannot live without you, you murder me, or perhaps most fundamentally stay or leave, stay, leave. Oh, and our standard way of reading the story is to say that the reason we need to have rules of kinship clearly known is that they will keep us from committing acts of murder and incest. But of course, if we think about domestic violence, the propensity for murders to be committed by an intimate, and even the commission of incest within existing family forms, then neither murder nor incest are really solved through recourse to kinship. Indeed, they seem to be an integral part of the story. Further, if we seek to establish a difference between human communities and the life of animals by claiming that humans are structured by kinship, then we invest kinship with a humanizing force, one that is exercised at the same time that gender is unequivocally established and heterosexual reproduction made the defining structure of kinship ties. And yet running through this story is the idea that certain equivocations tend to recur and that they cannot be legislated away by rules of any kind. I mentioned those that we found in Oedipus, mother, lover, father, stranger. For Antigone, there seems to be brother, lover, and uncle, sovereign. These are all forms of seeing double, as it were, and that surely is what is happening when Dionysus and Pentheus are at once man and woman, and when Agawe's son becomes man, woman, animal. We can read the story to get to the end and then try to figure out its moral, or we can see what interrupts the story as it proceeds, equivocations and echoes that are perhaps the psychic reverberations of kinship, found especially in structures of ambivalence. Those recurring forms of doubleness interrupt the sequence of the story, suggesting that the ties of kinship that cross and link the human and the animal are not exactly opposites, not mutually exclusive possibilities, but cousins, even kissing cousins, as Frances Bartkowski has argued in her book by that name. Is the human not always a human animal, and how would we extract the animality from the human? And who is more animal in the killing scene, Agawe, the huntress, or Pentheus, cross-dressed, killed as a lion? At the end of the Bacchae, it seems we are in a world of the fully awake, with Agawe having undergone a quick and painful detoxification and moral illumination. Is Cadmus the spectator who is now on stage? Does he himself undergo nothing? In some ways, he does not recognize his own destructiveness. He makes Agawe recognize it, but then he takes on the punishment, inheriting it from his daughter. Nietzsche was but one critic of Euripides, who found himself angered by endings such as these, since they finally refuse intoxication and even sexuality in the name of shame, moral ascesis, the paternal law, and self-punishment. The outbreak of violent destruction among kin surely gives good grounds for firming up the laws of kinship, especially the taboos against murder and incest. But does that happen because kin relations were lost or suspended? Or does that happen because violence and destruction within kinship are some of its constitutive modalities? Does the situation of final recognition take the form of a call to law and order? In some ways, yes, but it also makes us see double, as it were, and suggests something about the doubleness that characterizes kin relations, with or without our knowing. Who did the deed? It was not me, but it was me. How could that be the case? I could not have done this, or I did not do this, but I did, and so I do not know anymore who I am. To what lands of unknowing and disorientation have I been banished? These are the questions that belong to Agawe, but also to Cadmus. Does the punishment restore a human order, or do we see that the order we call human depends upon those traversals of categories of gender, humanness, and animality that are recurrent and constitutive? Agawe is surely not alone in thinking her son was a mountain lion. Oliver Sacks tells us a story with some humor and seriousness about the man who mistook his wife for a hat. His point is to elaborate on the neurological conditions for misrecognition. But are there other conditions for misrecognition as well? And can they be found in the emotional dispositions of kin relations, ones that are, after all, usually characterized by forms of dependency that are sometimes unmanageable, enraging, intoxicating, and blinding, difficult to see or grasp, and which make the right course of action difficult to see or apprehend? And though Greek tragedy often relies on certain forms of blindness that seek to demonstrate why we need to have clear sight, it is equally true that sometimes not being able to see the surface of reality gives one greater powers of apprehension, which is the case with Tiresias, the blind prophet, whose visions are more lucid than anyone else's. The problem is not exactly that Agawe did not see what was in front of her, but that she could not recognize that the young animal could also be her son. What drove her in ways that she herself could not recognize? And in what way did she wish not to see those very forces by which she was driven? Dionysus is sometimes the name we give to this problem, one that surely also surfaces in Freud's theory of the drives. We might say, in psychoanalytic terms, that such scenes in Greek tragedy bring to the fore the problem of the relation between the demands of recognition and the life of the drive. But if we want to go in that direction, we would need to understand more about how desire, rage, and grief define and threaten kinship. What threatens kinship, in other words, is that the passions on which it depends and which it generates are precisely those that break its bonds. If we conclude from Greek tragedies such as the Bacchae that we need laws that will govern kin relations more firmly, then we've arrived perhaps at an important ethical insight. It's crucial that murder and incest be proscribed for any number of reasons, and it's also crucial that, especially within kin relations, those that involve caring for those who are in dependent positions, that exploitation be opposed. But should we not care equally about the murder or exploitation of those who are not kin? Why does kinship establish the limits of nonviolent and non-exploitative action? Further, which version of kinship are we asked to accept? when we argue that a child ought not to be disregarded or misrecognized or become the recipient of brutal or violent behavior, are we claiming that a child requires a caring environment, the loving attention of those who care for him or her, and even that those who are caretakers undergo whatever ethical formation and struggle is required to provide that sustaining environment and to make sure those aggressive impulses do not turn into violent actions? My view is that we don't need to institute restrictive accounts of kinship based on positions of mutual exclusion in order to provide for a caring environment and a proscription on intimate violence. We know that relations can and do break apart for any number of reasons, and sometimes they endure. They break and resume several times, or they suddenly or slowly start, take hold, and are formed anew. Sometimes they even endure in a loving way, or so I have been told. Can these stories return us to the problem? I'm about to finish here. Can these stories return us to the problem of those breaks in kinship that seem to be part of its very definition, and those forms of misrecognition that seem to characterize the life of kin relations? In a film called A Kid with a Bike, Le Gamin en Vélo, by the Dardenne brothers, a boy finds himself in a situation where his mother is dead and his father has abandoned him. He's left with no discernible kin relations. In fact, he's put in an institution for boys from which he regularly runs away. In one such scene, he has bolted on foot from the institution and decides to try to find his old bicycle. That old bicycle was a treasured gift from his father. And slowly, he comes to understand that his father has, in fact, sold the bicycle. He says quite clearly, this is simply not possible. He tells everyone, my father would not have sold the bike. He's also saying, my father would not have abandoned me. And in the middle of a most difficult struggle against the recognition that his father indeed did deliberately leave him, and that the bike was in fact sold for money that his father needed for his own purposes, the boy becomes angry, can barely stand that recognition, and he starts running away from the institutional caretakers who have tried to bring him back, and he runs and runs and runs. The idea of the father is coming apart. Who is his father? Is that man still his father? Father, stranger. Has he been disowned? He runs inside an office at the apartment building where he used to live, and a woman he does not know is sitting in the waiting room. And by accident, he's thrust upon her, or thrusts himself, it's unclear. Let's just say a certain drive is at work, and he finds himself with his arms around her, clutching madly this unknown person. The adults in the office apologize to the woman and his caretakers who are trying to take him back to the institution, apologize, and she says, he's still clutching her, it's fine if you want to hold on to me, but please just not so hard. So they don't even know each other's names, and yet here he is embracing her, a stranger accidentally there, and she, for whatever reason, accepts his embrace. They do over time become kin, and maybe at that moment of the unchosen embrace, they became kin. The story is oddly Christian for sure, but what becomes clear is that she becomes his kin without precisely becoming his mother. She doesn't sew him into her thigh, but she does take over the caretaking process. Motherhood is not the language they need or use, though what she becomes is surely allied with that term. Those tied to one another through biology don't come through for one another in this film, but those who are strangers to one another lend their bodies at urgent moments, initiating a new kin relation, not only a new person admitted into existing kinship, but a new form of kinship, or so it seems. Who are they to one another? We could answer the question affirmatively and say that they have become kin, but if we do that too quickly, we risk forgetting that one recurring feature of becoming kin is precisely to ask the question, who are you? What are we to one another? Who am I to you? Perhaps kinship happens precisely when we are least sure trying to focus, vacillating, suspended in a state of protracted incredulity. It is probably also marked by the ethical dilemma posed by destructive passions that have the power to transform what we see and lead us to assert with certainty that we have not destroyed when we clearly have. Perhaps kinship is the place where at least one very fundamental kind of destructiveness and remorse follow upon each other in quick succession. Perhaps as well it raises other sorts of questions. Why are we more horrified by doing violence to those who are our kin than those who are not? And should it finally matter whether Agawe killed a human or an animal? Does the play perhaps open up a wider set of questions about what or who is justifiably killed and who is not? The grief and remorse make sense because the mother mistakenly killed her son. But what about all those other casualties that are unrelated to us, the innumerable civilians destroyed in current wars? Should we be concerned only to safeguard the lives of our kin, or do we need rather badly to expand that category until it achieves a global dimension? After all, if we claim that some human who was killed was not really a human, but only a human shield, or if we claim that some animal does not deserve the same solicitude as a human life, we are deciding a rather arbitrary limit to our prohibition on killing. If kinship delimits who we may kill and who we may most want to kill, then it would seem that if the prohibition on killing is to be as general as possible, so too must be our understanding of kinship. If the very concept of kinship dissolves as it expands, that may be a necessity or an occasion for new vocabularies through which to grasp our most basic ties and basic passions. For there seems to be no way to think the bonds of kinship without understanding first what breaks them. That breakability is the bond. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Very kind. Thank you very much. Thank you. I think that similar enough.
So profound and so challenging are the issues raised by Judith Butler in her lecture this evening that one could devote another 15 minutes or more to exploring and discussing them further. But there are drinks outside, you're thirsty, so let's be brief. One of the points that Professor Butler makes is that disruption seems to lie at the heart of kinship and ideas of kinship. We appear to know kinship relations precisely when kinship relations are liable to breach, to disruption, and to upheaval. Greek tragedy, of course, is full of kinship relationships that are strained or even broken. But one form this breach or disruption takes in tragedy is that of doubleness. So it is in Euripides' Bacchae that we see not just a disturbance in kinship relations, but also, as we heard, something about the doubleness that characterizes kinship relations. She loves me, she doesn't love me, this animal is not my son, this animal is my son, Semele is my mother, and Zeus is also my mother. This doubleness is worth dwelling on for a moment. There's a scene in the play when this doubleness is rendered explicit. And that is when Pentheus says to Dionysus, I see two suns and a double Thebes. And Pentheus then adds, and you, that is you, Dionysus, are a bull I see leading me forward now. A pair of horns seems to have grown upon your head. Were you a beast before? You have become a bull. Pentheus cannot quite recognize Dionysus. Two suns, two Thebes, bull and horns, god and man, god and animal. The complexity of the exchange between Pentheus and Dionysus seems to point, among other things, to doubleness and misrecognition. Pentheus sees the stranger, but doesn't recognize him to be his cousin, the god Dionysus. Why this might be so is a question we may reasonably ask. Again, in the terrible scene near the end of the play, Agave sees the animal but fails to grasp that the young animal could also be her son, and she comes only belatedly to the knowledge that the head she holds in her hands is the head of the child she has just killed. As our speaker asks this evening, what drove her in ways that she herself could not recognize, and in what way did she wish not to see those very forces by which she was driven? Judith Butler is, of course, absolutely right to emphasize the importance of this instance of misrecognition and to suggest that one of its problems lies precisely in the easy manner in which Agave initially believes that her act of killing is justified. The scene, and perhaps the play as a whole, raises the question, what are the limits placed by kinship on violent and non-violent action? In Agave's case, the thrill of the hunt is followed by remorse and sadness, murderous pleasure and infinite remorse, to use our speaker's words. But what would Agave's remorse have been, and indeed what her pleasure, if she had killed something other than her son? Would she have felt less remorse if she had killed another human being, a human being who was not her son? And then, as our speaker indicates, there's also the relationship between the animal and the human, for the play seems to suggest that Agave has no problem at all with the decapitation of a lion. She is, of course, full of remorse for having killed her son, but would she have felt no regret about the killing of an animal? The relationship between human and animal is a point of particular stress in the broadened conception of kinship that our speaker urges us to consider this evening. And as Judith Butler rightly insists in her wonderful, provocative and challenging paper, kinship is part of a whole series of pressing issues about justice, ethics, and life that we need to confront urgently today more than ever. The reception is outside.